And great. All right, so we'll wait a few seconds. There's a little latency anyway. And how are things in your neck of the woods these days?
We are, it's we should come down. It's, I mean, like the rest of Britain, it feels fairly sad. I mean, Brighton is lovely because, you can get to the sea or you can get to the downs and walk and do great stuff. Yeah. But the sort of built environment feels very sad. Yeah. Although I don't know, have you been walking around in empty London? That always struck me as a great thing to do anyway.
Yeah, it's both somewhat ominous and surreal in a dystopian sense, but it's also a joy because there's nobody on the streets. And so you can actually just literally walk down the middle of the streets in many occasions around Chelsea.
Right. And just, yeah. Well,
take
it exactly. I mean, I figure you can see, architecture nuts must just be having a field day because you can actually see what you never are allowed to. So yeah,
that's right. And the freedom without the compression of people.
Exactly. Oh, well, come on lockdown. I'm gonna come to the South Bank and bug you.
That sounds good. Great. Yeah. Good. Well, welcome everyone. We are live with our special guest for the month of March is free public lecture series by GCAS. And we'd like to thank our sponsors, all you who are contributing, and many of you are watching now. So thank you so much for just contributing your funds to help support what is needed today. There's so many campaigns out there to try to prevent free thinking and expert intellectuals from actually having a voice. And so through this series, we're proud to be able to offer folks like our guest today, Carla Power, to come on and give her talk about what she does, how she writes, and how important it is to understand her work and her position. And so I'm going to introduce her now, and then we'll get started with today's talk. Oh, and by the way, I do have some good news. Our first Nobel Peace Prize recipient will also be part of this series next year. And so I'm excited about that. So this is really exciting. And I'm so happy to have Carla with us today. Just before I give you the formal introduction, I just want to say to everyone, I met Carla in Paris, and we know each other through a mutual friend, her roommate at Yale, Margaret Young, who is watching. Hi, Margaret. Hi, Rocky. And Margaret is also part of GCAS. And of course, Margaret's husband, Rocky, is one of my dear friends. So it's really nice to connect again and to have you back on. And you actually gave a lecture in conjunction with Luce Rigorai's seminar in Paris. Remember that?
Do indeed. I'm still blinking about it. I can't believe that actually happened.
It's really great. It's really great. Well, let me introduce you. Carla is a journalist specializing in Muslim societies, global social issues, and culture. Power is the author of If the Oceans Were Ink, An Unlikely Friendship and Journey to the Heart of the Quran. This book is an account of her years spent studying with a traditional Islamic scholar. Her book, in fact, If the Oceans Were Ink, was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize and was a National Book Award finalist. She is a former correspondent for Newsweek, where she produced award-winning stories reporting from Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Her essays and reportage have appeared in a wide range of publications, and I'll just name a few, from Vogue magazine to the Oprah magazine, to Time, the New York Times magazine, The Guardian, and Foreign Policy, and there are many others. Power holds an MPhil from St. Anthony's College, Oxford University in modern Middle Eastern studies, as well as degrees from Yale and Columbia. Carla is married with 2 children. And in fact, you can see a painting that is a material expression of her family. They all did that. It's beautiful. And resides in England. And so we're really pleased to have you. Her talk today is entitled Chipping Away at the construct of the jihadist terrorist, a look at what rehabilitation programs can teach a polarized world. Carla, warm welcome to you.
Thank you so much, Creston. And I want to thank you again for inviting me to speak here at GCAS. As you said, it's my second talk for you all. And you know, that the last time I did it, it involved the tremendously glamorous preparation of taking the Eurostar to Paris and meeting you and Luce Rigore. And today was, I just basically looked around my flat to find a place where I can avoid the dog and my relatives. But that's okay. That's okay. Such is pandemic life. And in any case, it's a real honor to be here. So thank you. I'd like to speak today, if I could, about the journey that I've taken over the last few years. One that's going to, that's become a book called Homeland Security, How to De-Radicalize Our World. It should be out in the States in the autumn from One World Press. The project began because I'm very interested in stereotypes and the construction of stereotypes of non-Muslim, of Muslims by non-Muslims. So I was really interested in the pretty much one-dimensional image of the jihadi terrorists that had been produced in the Western media, first in the wake of the September 11th attacks and subsequently with the rise and fall of the so-called Islamic State. So what I'd love to do is talk at first a little bit about the uses and abuses of the image of the terrorists and suggest some ways that that's actually generated a punitive rather than a rehabilitative model, particularly in Anglo-American spheres and in some other Western countries. And then give you a little tour d'horizon of the de-radicalization programs and end with a case study of a town in Belgium that I think suggests new and really interesting ways of thinking about how Western societies can work to counter polarization, extremism, and even terrorism. Like many Americans, I spent the winter after Trump's election with my blood humming, a sense of some new poison coursing through both the country and myself. By day, I was researching the process of radicalization, particularly among young Westerners who had joined the so-called Islamic State. And as I read about them, I recognized something of my own post-election mental state. If one definition of radicalization is a narrowing of one's worldview, a whittling away of the will and wherewithal to understand other points of view, I was getting a taste of it firsthand, and it really scared me. I was describing this project to a veteran in publishing, saying that I was finding it was a fitting thing to explore during a period when I felt that much of the nation was in effect being radicalized. I explained that while the stories I was gathering were of foreign wars and jihadi militants, their situations bore hints of the increased polarization and extremism I saw infecting American political culture. And he hesitated and he was like, surely that's a bit much. He was like, I don't think Americans are ready to read a book comparing them to ISIS. But so fast forward 4 years, and as so often happens, an idea once deemed radical is now mainstream. By last month, in the wake of the January 6th Capitol riot, a publication as iconoclastic as the Ohio Capitol Journal, the stated purpose on its website is connecting Ohioans to their state government, was asking de-radicalization experts how Trump-era extremists compare to ISIS. After the attack, Elizabeth Naumann, who led counterterrorism efforts under Trump for 3 years, told Time magazine that the President Trump's role for the insurrectionists was akin to that of Osama bin Laden's, quote, spiritual leadership of the 9/11 hijackers. She urged the US to pursue the insurgents, quote, with the same intensity that we did Al-Qaeda. Now, after 9/11, violent extremism was all but equated with Islamist jihadi groups. The story was told over and over again of how terror in the United States dropped out of a clear blue September sky. It took another day of national trauma 20 years on for many Americans to see what statistics showed and what people of color had long known from experience, that the most serious terror threat was not foreign, dark, and Muslim, but white and American made. Like the babysitter in the horror movie, who realizes that the serial killer isn't out in the woods behind the house, but actually inside the house. The country has finally begun to recognize the proximity of our own violent extremism. Our most serious threats are internal, not external, observed former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel. Politically armed insurgents, extremists, fascist groups, and other active destructive forces are now part of the American landscape. Now, defining a terrorist has always been an inherently politicized process. Who gets called terrorist and who is deemed, say, a freedom fighter depends on who does the calling and when. The US Army actually once tallied over 100 definitions of terrorism, which makes sense when one glimpses the ways the powerful use or abuse the term. Jonathan Powell, who was a lead negotiator in the Northern Ireland peace process, observed that terrorism is, quote, something used by governments to instill fear at home or support the enemies of their enemies abroad. Back in the 80s, Osama bin Laden was among those freedom fighters that Ronald Reagan praised so effusively for battling the Soviet Empire in Afghanistan. During the struggle against apartheid, the South African government imprisoned Nelson Mandela as a terrorist. And just last year, the Saudi Arabian government sentenced Loujain al-Hathloul, an activist who'd campaigned for women's right to drive, under its counter-terror legislation. The words extremist and radical, often carelessly tossed together with terrorist, have suffered similar deployments. From 2017 to 2019, the FBI fashioned the new category of Black identity extremist to denote any Black activist it felt merited surveillance. And this is global, I'm afraid. We live in an age when Russia has banned Jehovah's Witnesses on grounds of their being extremist, when Chinese officials claim that 1 million Uyghur Muslims in mass internment camps are enjoying so-called de-radicalization. And, you know, how one defines these terms is so slippery and can be used to such effect that in 2019, the UK government, who had tried for years to nail extremist as a legal term, finally had to give up. So elusive was the definition. As Martin Luther King pointed out from his cell in Birmingham, despairing of how white moderates had labeled his actions extremists, extremism has an honorable legacy. If he was an extremist, so too were Paul, Martin Luther, and Jesus. Nearly all extremism is relative, of course. What some define as extreme depends almost entirely on where you stand. And when. A statesman is often just yesterday's terrorist plus time. Reflecting on how realpolitik can make former militants respectable, the British politician Hugh Gateskill once quipped, "All terrorists, at the invitation of the government, end up with drinks in the Dorchester," a very ritzy hotel in London. To be sure, not all terrorists turn into statesmen. The historian Michael Burley once observed that if you imagine Osama bin Laden is going to evolve into Nelson Mandela, you need a psychiatrist rather than a historian. Still, the 2017 death of former IRA leader Martin McGuinness showed that former terrorists can craft lives with second acts. The IRA chief of staff became a peacemaker in the 1990s and eventually Northern Ireland's deputy first minister. On his death, the man who had once commanded paramilitaries killing British soldiers received tributes from world leaders, including Queen Elizabeth herself. Former enemies may be allowed makeovers, but current ones are rarely portrayed as capable of reform. After every terrorist attack in the West, the media tells the story of the perpetrator's journey, a Bildungsroman which inevitably ends in violence. When a boy joined al-Shabaab or al-Qaeda, or when a girl snuck off to join ISIS, they were effectively dead to us. Having joined a listed terror organization, they were no longer dynamic human beings, but a static target. Whether as a Guantanamo inmate or a target of American drone strikes, or a former fighter for the Islamic State, the jihadi lives in law as well as in the imagination beyond the boundaries of civilized society. The Bush administration, who used the term unlawful enemy combatant, which allowed them to detain and interrogate terror suspects without being hamstrung by Geneva Convention rules. After the destruction of ISIS's so-called caliphate, countries around the world debated whether the 50,000 odd foreign fighters in Syria should be repatriated or left to fend for themselves in refugee camps. And the frank language deployed by some Western leaders stripped the fighters of any humanity, as when Britain's defense secretary announced that his government should, quote, destroy and eliminate anyone who fought in Syria. Even the spectacularly urbane Rory Stewart, a former British government minister who speaks 9 languages, taught human rights at Harvard, and set up a nonprofit for artisans in Afghanistan, responded to the threat of foreign fighters coming back from Syria thus: unfortunately, the only way of dealing with them will be, in almost every case, to kill them. With the defeat of the Islamic State, this has been revised by some countries to mean leaving these ISIS supporters to occupy a legal limbo in Syrian refugee camps. And actually just last week, the famous case of Shamima Begum, a schoolgirl who'd left for Syria at 15 and then wanted to come back to the UK, had her citizenship stripped by the then Home Secretary, who claimed that because her parents had been born in Bangladesh, she was eligible for Bangladeshi citizenship, so he could strip her of her citizenship. Last month, the Supreme Court unanimously refused her appeal to return to fight the case in court, so she will not get her day in court and won't be allowed to return. Such legal and political constructs dovetail neatly with the older Orientalist tropes affixed to the jihadi terrorist. Rather than framed as criminals or militants or even frustrated citizens living in corrupt, chaotic, or autocratic states without legitimate means of political dissent, they're cast too often as existential threats to Western civilization. The battle against terrorism, leaders from Bush to Trump have told us, is, quote, as Trump said in 2017, a battle between good and evil. Such rhetoric chokes off inquiry about why people resort to violent extremism. It blocks out the possibilities of change or redemption, seals off routes to a deeper understanding as to why these acts occur. Hannah Arendt may have shown us the banality of Nazi evil, but those ascribed to the modern jihadi remain otherworldly. He is denied banality, denied the context that may allow him reason and that might explain, though not excuse, reasons for his fight. I've spent the last couple years looking at the way people are lured into joining violent extremist groups and how various countries work to help them leave. And those who study the process of radicalization say that the only certain thing about why people are drawn into these groups is that it's highly individual and it's highly complex. Tabloid culture has encouraged us in the West to link terror with holding radical beliefs. But over and over again, the literature of violent extremism suggests that holding radical beliefs doesn't necessarily lead to terrorism. There isn't a sort of conveyor belt which begins with sympathy for a cause and ends in violence. People who hold extremist beliefs might not support violence, and there are people who commit terrorist offenses without knowledge of extremist ideology. Mark Sageman, a former CIA officer and a sort of eminence grise in the counterterrorism world, states bluntly, despite decades of research, we still don't know what leads people to engage in political violence. Over the years, I've heard such a range of explanations for the causes and cures for violent extremism that I feel like one of the proverbial blind men trying to figure out the shape of an elephant, or rather a herd of elephants, as I now recognize that the reasons a French student might join ISIS would be, of course, vastly different to those that an Afghan tribesman might agree to fight with the Taliban. And there's a huge variation even within particular countries. In the 90s, I sat in a madrasa in Northwest Pakistan talking to children who were being prepared to fight jihad in Afghanistan, many of whom were there simply because their parents couldn't afford to feed them. And the only schools that were providing hot lunches and some sort of instruction in these impoverished regions were madrasas who had funding to stoke to create soldiers for the war in Afghanistan. That was in the 1990s, when analysts would often confidently state that poverty was a key cause of violent extremism. But it didn't explain the radicalization of the Pakistani army major I met a couple years later in Lahore. He was wealthy, living in a colonnaded White House in a fancy neighborhood with a daughter studying English literature. And he'd been trained by the Green Berets to fight the Russians in Afghanistan and had used some of his wealth as a textile merchant, I believe, to set up a jihadi training camp in Kashmir. His commitment to militancy clearly didn't come from poverty, lack of education, or even particularly strong feelings about the political battle between India and Pakistan. When I asked him whether he'd stop fighting if the Kashmir issue were resolved, he said no, he would keep fighting until all the world was Muslim. If religious ideology was a driver for this Pakistani major, it clearly wasn't for the young guy I met in Birmingham right after 9/11, who admitted he'd been into drugs and clubs before being inspired by Osama bin Laden as some sort of anti-imperialist hero. So to get just a glimpse of how manifold the drivers to militancy can be, just a squiz at the United Nations violent extremism plan out in 2016, which attempted to list them. People could be susceptible to push factors, including lack of socioeconomic opportunities, marginalization and discrimination, poor governance, violations of human rights and the rule of law, prolonged and unresolved conflicts, and radicalization in prisons. And that's just the push factors. They could also be susceptible to pull factors, individual backgrounds and motivations, collective grievances and victimization stemming from domination, oppression, subjugation, or foreign intervention, distortion and misuse of beliefs, political ideologies, ethnic and cultural differences, and leadership and social networks. The closer one looks, the drivers for militancy, it's like a map as big as the world kind of thing. They are not simply the failings of the individual or clearly individual groups, as they are so often cast by tabloid headlines or populist politicians. Rather, they are indications of broader systemic failures or injustices. Sarah Chase, in her brilliant investigation of how corruption threatens global security, points out that when she interviewed Taliban supporters following the 2003 invasion by the United States, it was usually discussed at government corruption that helped Taliban recruitment. Out of 100 Taliban, she said, fewer than a quarter were real. The rest had taken up arms in disgust with the government. And it's interesting because revulsion at another form of systemic injustice, patriarchal culture, can also boost militancy's appeal in some quarters. In Nigeria, for example, the limited life choices for many rural Nigerian women can make joining Boko Haram seem almost a liberation of sorts, according to Dr. Fatima Akilu, psychologist and founder of the Nigerian government de-radicalization program. For women from villages where they'd be married off at 9 or 10, a pitch from a militant to join up or to marry him could sound really attractive. Some of the lures would be that the militants would say, you can have slaves, you can, run the whole show as my wife, you can work, which you probably couldn't do outside the house, as a cook or assembling bombs. And breaking with the customs in many villages, the women were also promised to have the right to divorce in the case of an unhappy marriage. For the first time in their lives, says Dr. Akilu, they were offered so many choices and actually achieved great power within Boko Haram. And there's a corollary to this story too, which was when Akilu and the Nigerian government tried to rehabilitate former Boko Haram fighters. It was much harder to de-radicalize the women, she said, than it was the men, because quite simply, the men had less to lose by going back to a mainstream patriarchal society. Now, the various approaches to de-radicalization or rehabilitation around the world is beyond the scope of this, but most programs attempt to do broadly what Daniel Kohler, who is the founding director of the German Institute on Radicalization and De-radicalization Studies, describes as repluralization, which is a reversal of the depluralization that you undergo when you are radicalized. When a recruit's world is shrunk to a place divided into good and evil, us and them. So a repluralization is a widening of this worldview. It's interesting because in contrast to the sort of lock 'em up approach that the United States took to jihadi extremists in the wake of 9/11, where even young people, and I mean young, 18, 19-year-old guys who even before they got on the planes to go to Turkey were facing the possibility of 20-year sentences for providing material support to terrorist groups. So you could be caught at the airport and face a really, really long sentence. In contrast to this, there are thousands of people and programs across Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe that are working with former violent extremists in a variety of ways. Imams, psychologists, social workers are attempting to, whether after they've served their prison sentences or even just if they've come home from foreign wars, attempting to knit them back into their communities rather than simply fighting, jailing, or exiling them. Some of these programs are elaborate and state-sponsored, as in Saudi Arabia, which was a very early program, where former militants are sent to a center with an Olympic-sized swimming pool, and where the process of rehabilitation includes the government liaising with their families and tribes, so that there's widespread community buy-in to the process. And at times, the Saudi government even pays for these guys to get married, with the idea that settling down will de-radicalize your outlook. Other approaches are run on a shoestring and are intensely local, like the programs run in Pakistan by a group called the Payman Alumni Trust, which trains village women to search for signs for extremists in their communities and stand up to extremism when they come across it in their neighborhoods. Almost all of these programs involve huge amounts of personalized time and effort. The idea of having a single program that you can just insert people into and out will come nice little citizens simply doesn't work. It is expensive, it is long-term, and it just takes a huge amount of work. I'm thinking of one program in terms of being in it for the long haul, again in Pakistan, that's regarded by many in the counterterrorism field as being the most successful rehabilitation program in the world. And it's set high in the foothills of the Hindu Kush, and it's called Sabayun. It's a boarding school for children who had been recruited to the Pakistani Taliban. It claims a rate of zero recidivism, and that is in part because it has just incredible long-term thinking. The institution has committed not only to educating these boys, giving them therapy, but doing it also with the communities they come from and supporting them through into their adult lives as they embark going to university or starting businesses. One of the characters in my book is a guy who started off as a child recruit to the Taliban and really had to do some rather eye-raising things, but ended up, after going to the school, going on and getting his psychology degree, and he has returned to the school as a psychologist. So it's a full 180 degree turn. Level devoted to rehabilitating either jihadis or white supremacist extremists. There are programs looking at helping people at risk or former extremists, looking at it through social lenses, psychological lenses. There are programs that harness the country's youth culture scenes, skateboarding, DJing, punk, music. Others that are devoted to family therapy, individual therapy, others that hone in on questions of masculinity and femininity in the movements, and scores of individual mentorships, some of which can last for years and years. I highlight Germany in part because too often we look at extremism through the lens of the individual rather than structural issues pushing people towards extremism. Germany certainly knows the difficulties of trying to de-radicalize a whole nation. And as both my birth country, the United States, and my adoptive country, Britain, are attempting to confront their legacies of slavery and imperialism, they could do worse, I think, than to look at Germany as a lesson in how to confront the uglier parts of your past. And I commend to you the amazing Learning from the Germans by Susan Niemann, who's born in Georgia in the USA, a moral philosopher who posits Germany as an potential inspiration for how the United States, at least, might reckon with its slave-owning past. Just 3 generations ago, of course, the Germans had to figure out how to build a tolerant society from one in which nearly half the doctors had been Nazi Party members and where the university science departments had taught racist theories. The Allies did their bit, each of them trying in their own re-education approaches, which, like so many de-radicalization programs, bore the stamp of their cultural beliefs. The Brits tried to take the Nazis off to to Cambridge and show them about parliamentary debate, and the Americans brought them back and tried to talk about freedom a lot, and the Russians did something else. So it was an interesting sort of index, cultural index of what each of these countries thought most important. But these were relatively short-lived programs, and perhaps more enduring and more successful was Germany's post-war constitution and its commitment to strijdbare Demokratie, or militant democracy, the idea that the country must be able to defend its liberal democratic system, even if it means curtailing some freedoms to do so. Mindful, of course, that Hitler came to power by parliamentary democracy, the Constitution's framers included in it what's known as the Eternity Clause, which states that certain principles endure forever beyond particular regimes or changes in party. Even a majority vote in the Bundestag can't snuff out human rights or the separation of powers. And the country's Supreme Court, in defense of the Constitution, can ban associations or political parties if they're deemed to undermine democracy or threaten the republic. Indeed, actually earlier this month, for the first time in Germany's post-war history, the Federal Office of the Protection of the Constitution concluded that the major opposition party, AfD, Alternative for Germany, had violated key principles of liberal democracy and placed it under surveillance for signs of extremism. The closer one looks at the problems of extremism and polarization, the more one hopes that societies will begin to do essentially what in the United States, the Black Lives Matter movement and the Me Too movements have spurred in terms of for the problems of racism and sexism. It should spur a forensic attempt to understand the systemic forces that go into the creation of polarization, extremism, and even terrorism, whether it's scrutiny of foreign or domestic policy, of the built environment, socioeconomic inequalities, tech algorithms, and the emotional problems like the epidemics of loneliness that can exacerbate radicalization. The issue itself is so highly individualistic and so complex that it seems to touch the further one looks on almost every aspect of our societies. And it really, I think, requires a whole of society effort to think about it, just as it requires a whole of community effort to reintegrate a former militant back into mainstream society. And I'm gonna close with talking a little bit about this case study I mentioned in thinking about structural ways that we could encourage populations to embrace pluralism and avoid hatred and the violence it leads to. I'd like to tell you the story of two Belgian towns that sit on the Brussels-Antwerp train line. Coincidentally, the train line that the Nazis used to haul off Jews to concentration camps. These two towns are called Vilvoorde, and just about 10 minutes away from it, Mechelen, and or Malines if you're speaking French. But and for a few years, not so long ago, both these small cities sat squarely on the richest seam for Islamic State recruits in the Western world. Belgium had Europe's highest per capita number of foreign fighters in Syria. And so Brussels, just to Mechelen's south, had about 200 people leave for Syria. Antwerp to the north lost 100 people. And in Vilvoorde, one of these towns, recruiters found the most receptive audience in Belgium and thus in the West. The town of 42,000 people would see 29 departures for Syria. And nearly every high school lost one of its students to Syria, a few of them even achieving high positions in the Islamic State's foreign ministry. And But the town acted quickly. It chose a strategy of support and reintegration, set up a 7-person team led by a young doctoral student in Islamic studies, and who decided that she was going to look at the root causes of social exclusion and not religion. And as she told me, it wasn't a case of looking for long beards, but bad social conditions. Much of her job was targeting youth suffering from isolation, long-term unemployment, or parental neglect. And when Vilvoord's foreign fighters started coming back to Belgium and were sent to prisons throughout Belgium, the town's mayor, Hans Bont, insisted on traveling to visit every returnee in 6 different prisons across the country. And he went to them, he talked to them, he said, "You're a citizen of Vilvoord and have the same rights as other citizens, but because of your past, we're going to be there to monitor you." And Vilvoord sort of served, in Bont's words, as a laboratory for Belgium and beyond that for Europe on how to deal with homegrown violent extremists. Mechelen is a laboratory devoted to preventing extremism in the first place. Because while towns all around it lost young people to the Islamic State, not a single person left from Mechelen. And, you know, the demographics are very much the same. Like Vilvoord, it's undergone rapid demographic changes over the last generation. It's had its economic fortunes plummet, and a very swift change from an all-white community to hyper-diverse population. Its 85,000 residents are now drawn from 138 nations, and 1 in 5 of its residents are Muslim. Now, that nobody defected to the Islamic State was partly luck, of course, but I think it also had a lot to do with a very deliberate and rather daring integration policies enacted by its mayor, Bart Summers. While many European politicians have cast integration as a job for recent migrants, like scrubbing toilets or sweeping streets, Summers took the view that it's the responsibility of every European, from bankers with bloodlines dating back to Charlemagne to the Aleppo-born refugee. Everybody has to adapt to the new normal, he says. His family lived in Mechelen for 17 generations before him. But as he points out, I am the first generation to live in the reality of diversity. So he sees this as a project the entire community has to get involved in. It's not just the job of newcomers to integrate. And the fact that Mechelen actually has more Muslims than Hungary led Summers to extend an impish public invitation to Hungary's president, Viktor Orban, after the far-right populist had called refugees, quote, Muslim invaders. And Summers called out to him saying, "We have more Muslims than Hungary and Slovakia put together, but we're safer, more prosperous, and more vibrant." And what Summers did was to try to recast what migration meant for this city. Migration in many people's minds had been something negative in the 1990s. When he was elected in 2001, a third of Mechelen's shops were vacant. It had the highest crime rate in Belgium, and a consumer magazine poll rated it the dirtiest city in Flanders. And because of this, or one of the reasons, fear about crime among white residents had helped boost the fortunes of the far-right Flemish party, Vlaams Belang. In 2004, a third of the town had voted for it. As Summers says, right-wing politicians try to make a connection between diversity and decline, says Summers. We tore it apart. And he did it by drawing together ideas from both the right and the left of the political spectrum. He's often accused of being a lefty by conservatives, but then He points to Mechelen's streets, which are now literally clean as dinner plates, and the security cameras watching above them. There's the town has the most per capita security cameras in Belgium. He put more cops on the streets, but made sure they were always unarmed and without body armor. And he said that the police surveillance was perversely, in large part, to tackle xenophobia. He said, if people don't feel safe on the streets, they'll blame two groups, Democratic politicians and migrants. They'll vote for populists at the polls and scapegoat newcomers in the streets. By converse, if the city feels safe, you strengthen trust in democracy, you create more openness for diversity, and you disconnect diversity from decline. And he says, we've showed that diversity and progress can go hand in hand. And along with this, he introduced a lot of policies that were traditionally from the left, I would say. But he also introduced a strict policy of integration. When a group of Muslim citizens petitioned to start an Islamic school, he turned them down, explaining that Mechelen did not do segregation. A Moroccan community football team was persuaded to open its doors to youth of all backgrounds. Parents have been persuaded to send their kids to schools in the city that deliberately mixed both the kids of professionals and recent immigrants who had to work menial jobs. And Summers is also sponsoring something he calls Mechelen's speed dating regime, where every foreign newcomer is matched with a Mechelen native, so the newcomer can practice his or her Dutch and learn the basics of Belgian life. Now, this commitment to inclusion was tested. I don't know if you remember, but there was a terror attack in Brussels in 2016 where 35 people died. And this happened just 20 minutes from Mechelen at the Brussels airport, where two of the bombs exploded. And Summers, of course, like everybody else, every other politician, commented on the killings and the killers, but his message was distinctly different, had a different timbre. He stressed that the country's Muslims are victims of such an attack twice over, once as Belgian citizens and once as people whose religion was being used to justify the attacks. The attacks were done by people born in Belgium, he made sure to tell Mechelen. They are terrorists, but they are our terrorists. They were born here, grew up here, go to our schools. They are our problem, and we have to work on it. And the night of the attacks, one of the boys at Mechelen youth clubs greeted the mayor crying, saying, "You're the first politician to say something like that. The first one who said, we are still a part of this society." Mechelen's success makes it a weapon against populism, says Summers. Street crime has fallen by 84%. And the magazine that found Mechelen the dirtiest city in Flanders now has declared it the cleanest. But when, and to be sure, not everybody agrees with Summers' approach. I ran into Mechelaars who said that they still felt unsafe, who grumbled that immigrants were getting more, bigger stipends than they did, having been born there. Vlaams Belang, the nativist party, has a shop front on the main square right across from the mayor's office. And not only that, it doubled its vote in 2019 from 4% to I think more than doubled its vote to 10% in Mechelen. But to be fair, that was far, far lower than the 25% it had received region-wide. When I met with Summers, I asked him whether his carefully curated civic policies might actually backfire. I mentioned George Orwell's observation in his prescient 1940 review of Mein Kampf that people don't necessarily long for peace and harmony, but they want to believe something fervently and to act on it. Human beings, says Orwell, don't only want comfort, safety, short working hours, hygiene, birth control, and in general, common sense. They also, at least intermittently, want struggle and self-sacrifice, not to mention drums, flags, and loyalty parades. And the anthropologist Scott Atran, who studies why people join militant groups, cites this Orwell piece of writing to suggest that we can't just think about providing people with good jobs and votes to try to figure out why people in the West are being drawn to extremist groups. And when I asked Summers about this, I was like, well, yeah, you can eat your dinner off the streets here, and it's quiet and it's prosperous, but will Mechelen's cozy strategy sort of satisfy it? And he agreed that people want a struggle that's big, but he sees that his struggle is one of collective heroism, and proving that the populists are wrong. And given the state of support for populism in the West at this time, he says that's a struggle that is worth fighting. So I will stop there.
Wow, that's such a beautiful and really inspiring, but also provocative in some ways talk. Thank you so much, Carla.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah. Well, it was fun. Yeah.
Great. Well, we're joined with two GCAS researchers, and Neely is in Sri Lanka and John is in Virginia. And we're just going to ask just a few questions, if you don't mind, and just engage.
Yeah, sure.
Or maybe we'll get you back to your family soon.
Sorry, they've seen far too much of me over the last year.
Thanks, Carla. And so I wonder if maybe John or Neely have a question. Otherwise, I can start too. So.
Yeah, I was thinking about how the brown body was kind of like thought of as, very destructive and deviant, especially if like people with, South Asian countries migrate to, places like Britain, US, Australia. I'm just wondering how this idea of terrorist is kind of like, is signified onto the bodies of women, especially Muslim women, with the ban of the burqa, especially in like countries like Switzerland. And it's going to happen very soon in Sri Lanka also. So
No, I think that's an excellent point. I mean, it becomes elided, the whole rhetoric, certainly about, you look at a place like France where, the ban of burqas in official public spaces really serves to signify that you are not only of a different religion, but you cannot participate in the public space. And the tragic thing is, in France, you'll see women who have trained as, are second generation or third generation immigrants who have trained as doctors and lawyers who, want to live the immigrant dream and assimilate in many ways, but want to do it wearing, a hijab, and they're thwarted. Which then, as I mentioned, you can't draw a line from A to B saying this will radicalize people, but it certainly contributes to a sense of not belonging, which in some cases can be a trigger amongst, some people for radicalization.
So I have a comment, or I have a question about that, but then I also have my own question afterwards. Is there ever a discussion about don't like Catholic nuns also wear like things that cover their heads? Is that ever discussed? Like, I don't actually know because I don't keep up with this. Is that ever discussed?
Well, that's an excellent point, and it is. There's a wonderful book by Joan Wallach Scott at Princeton about the French notion of why the Islamic hijab is and burqa is such an affront to the notion of French laicism, and I'm sorry, as the previous commentator suggested, it kind of punctures this notion of liberté, fraternité, égalité, where we are all citizens together, kind of thing. And it also, like the nuns and like the kippah, the Jewish skull cap, or like a cross, you would think that it would, all of these things sort of interrupt the kind of neutral public space that France has decided post-revolution that it wants to preserve. But somehow it does seem to be the burqa that makes officials most angry. So I think there are some racist issues going on there.
Yeah, and then my actual question is, so I spend a lot of time thinking about this kind of black and white people, or black and white thinking that I think people get into, this us versus them, or this mechanized way of viewing the world. I know you said explicitly a lot of times that there isn't one reason that people radicalize, but I was wondering how much do you think like the kind of reinforcing of black and white thinking of like an us versus them type of thing encourages maybe radicalization? And how do you think people can start to talk to others to kind of shatter that perspective? And I know you talked about this a tiny bit, but if you could say more on that, because it's scary. I think the US is starting to really push more and more towards that. It's frightening to me.
Absolutely. I mean, if I could figure that out, I mean, it's way above my pay grade. But no, I mean, I think that there are. I mean, I think the idea of repluralization. I mean, one of the reasons I highlight like Mechelen is what he really seemed to try to do is kind of regrow the connective tissue in society. So that, and very consciously, he wanted Mechelen's citizens to be seen not as single identities, because all of this rests on, you're a Republican, I'm a Democrat, or you're a, X, I'm Y. I mean, it's identity politics metastasized in a way so that we cannot somehow seem to get across this. And what he pointed out, and what admittedly is very easy to do in a relatively small city as opposed to the United States, but is to regrow connections to each other. So when you talk to people who have really rolled up their sleeves in this field, often what they will say is, we need things like, we need youth clubs. We need people to join bowling, the whole bowling alone thing. We need people to join bowling leagues again, so that you have some connective tissues to your fellow citizens that are not just these brittle and now very inflamed identities, as opposed to, that kind of malleability and multifaceted. So you see people as having a variety of facets rather than a single identity. And I think that that's something that both left and right really have to work on together, because I think both sides, certainly in the United States, have fallen into the trap of this kind of unidimensional, which then gets into a Manichaean us versus them thing. So, I mean, it's not rocket science in some ways. The problem is it's got to be society wide, I think, and that's really important. I mean, the Germans have come up with all these fascinating ways to do it, kind of one-on-one. And I'll for another time I'll talk about how they have these techniques with very long German names about sort of breaking down, when to challenge people and when to make them see, what you're like and how you are not just, Jewish or you're not. So I think people also talk about cognitive openings. You talk to like a former right-wing extremist, say, who, in prison will suddenly find himself playing chess with a Muslim, or and just this crack that the other is not entirely other can happen. The problem is, I think it's really difficult in a society like the United States, where people live pretty isolated lives. And I think that has contributed a lot to the mess we're in. I don't mean to blame it on suburbia and the cul-de-sac and the car, but I think there's a lot to what has happened in terms of kind of rampant individualism and how it has a lot to answer for. So, but I ramble anyway.
Amazing. I wanted to ask just one question and then we'll wrap this up. Although it feels like we're just starting. It's amazing. And it's really good research that you're doing. And my question has to do with your research. I wonder, to what degree do you feel pressures from institutions, from powers, home office or whatever, do you feel pressure when you're working through your research and trying to, raise consciousness and trying to break down that polarization that John was mentioning and that your talk is about? Do you feel that the kind of pressures to just get in line, toe the line? As a researcher, you're not supposed to really go and challenge certain mores. I wonder personally if you feel that kind of pressure. And if you could speak about that publicly, that would be, I don't know how you feel.
No, I really haven't. And mine, I don't rely on, government money or anything. I do know, some of the characters in my book, the book is just sort of a lot, me bopping around the world, talking to people who are much more invested in this. And I, there are stories of, the mothers of these Islamic State fighters, say, who came under certain pressures from their governments or sometimes, but I do think, particularly in Muslim majority countries, there's an openness of talking about these things that we haven't enjoyed in the West. And say in Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim country, the notion of what these people who are just people who have strayed from the path. And so governments will not see them necessarily as enemies, but as people to be brought back to the mainstream of their country. So it varies a lot, but I certainly haven't come up against any pressure at all. But in some cases it was hard to get information, which is why I mostly talk about NGOs rather than government programs, because there's a real secrecy surrounding those. And I wanted to make it as sort of personal and individual and textured as I could, because I'm, if you want academic studies, there are a lot of much better academic studies out there, and this is definitely journalistic. So.
Yeah, so you're more, you wouldn't necessarily ascribe yourself as a researcher, but more of a journalist. Is that right?
Oh, completely. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I this is highly unscientific. It's
Okay.
more, it's more about my reactions to going and seeing a variety of ways that people were dealing with this.
And different narratives and narrative development and okay. I see.
Yeah. It's definitely targeted at a mainstream audience rather than an academic. Yeah.
Right. Well, that's amazing, Carla. And we all want to thank you for
Oh,
being part of this today. And yeah,
it was a huge honor, and I hope it didn't go on too long. And
no, it's perfect. It's really great. We look
Great.
forward to working with you again, of course.
Excellent. I love it. I love it.
To see you soon, sometime before
Good.
too long.
Good.
Carla,
Excellent.
thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks everyone for watching another GCAS free public lecture. Join us next month where we have Charlene Edge, who will talk about her breaking away from a cult, a Christian cult, and her struggles inside that cult and her recovery. So we're looking forward to Charlene next month. Thank you all so much, and we wish you the best. Although we're isolated physically, we're not isolated socially. Let's keep connecting. Thank you all.